A cloak trembles at the mouth of a cave. The mountain is still, but the man standing there is not. His breath is tired. His body has crossed wilderness dust. His heart has carried fear farther than anyone could see. According to the biblical account, Elijah came to Horeb after a season of danger, exhaustion, and deep loneliness. We should be careful not to imagine more than Scripture gives us. But the scene itself is powerful enough. A prophet who once stood in public courage now stands hidden in silence. And maybe that is why this story still reaches the wounded heart. Because some lonely seasons do not look like failure at first. They look like waiting. They look like closed doors, unanswered prayers, and quiet rooms where no one knows how much strength it takes to keep breathing. But what if the silence was not proof that God had forgotten him? What if the cave was not only a place of fear, but a protected place where God was preparing Elijah to recognize a voice deeper than panic? If you have ever wondered whether God still sees you in a hidden season, this story may speak gently to that wound. The cloak was pulled tight around his face. At the mouth of a cave on Horeb, the mountain of God, a prophet stood in a silence so heavy, it almost felt like the world had stopped breathing. According to the biblical account, Elijah had come there after fear, exhaustion, and a long wilderness road. Stones surrounded him. The cave behind him looked less like shelter and more like the inside of a wound. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Now stay with this image. A man who had once stood with courage, now standing alone where no crowd could see him. There are lonely seasons that do not look dramatic from the outside. No one sees the room after the phone stops ringing. No one sees the prayer whispered when strength is gone. No one sees the person who once believed clearly now asking, quietly, if God has gone silent. Elijah's story matters because it does not begin with weakness. It begins with a man who had known the power of God. The biblical narrative presents him as a prophet in a time of deep spiritual conflict. He had spoken, confronted, prayed, and stood where others might have trembled. And yet, in 1 Kings 19, the man who had stood publicly is found running privately. The voice that had once sounded strong is now wrapped in fear. That is what makes this story so sacredly human. Sometimes the hardest loneliness does not come before obedience. Sometimes it comes after it. A person gives, serves, waits, prays, endures, and keeps going. Then one day, they look around and realize they feel alone. Not just socially alone, spiritually alone. The kind of alone that asks, if God saw me, why does this feel so empty? If God called me, why does my heart feel so tired? If I tried to be faithful, why does silence seem louder than comfort? The cave at Horeb becomes more than a place in an ancient story. Spiritually, it becomes an image of every hidden place where fear and prayer meet. We should be careful not to overstate what can be proven about the exact cave or the precise mountain location. Traditions about Horeb and Sinai are complex, but the biblical scene itself is clear enough to wound and comfort us. At the same time, Elijah is alone, and God is not finished with him. That is the first mystery. The cave looks like the end of a voice. It looks like the place where a prophet disappears. It looks like fear has succeeded in pushing him out of public courage and into private collapse. But what if the lonely place is not always the place where God leaves? What if the season that made you feel forgotten was not proof that heaven had stepped away, but the place where God began quieting every voice that could not heal you? The hidden truth is not fully visible yet. Elijah does not know it as he stands there. The viewer should not know it too quickly either, because the story must be allowed to ache. Loneliness cannot be healed by rushing past it. The wound was real. The exhaustion was real. The fear was real. And still, Elijah is standing at the edge of a revelation, not in a palace, not in a crowd, not in the applause of people who finally understood him, but in a cave. And to understand why he is there, we have to follow the road backward, away from the mountain, away from the silence, back into the wilderness, where the prophet first began to walk alone. Before the cave, there was the road. We can imagine the dust rising around Elijah's feet as he moved away from everything familiar. The biblical account presents him as afraid and fleeing. It does not give us every detail of his face, his breath, or the heaviness in his chest. So any scene we picture must remain reverent imagination. But Scripture does show the movement Elijah leaves, goes into the wilderness, and separates from the support that might have kept him from feeling utterly alone. That is the first visible wound. A prophet who once stood in public now walks into distance. His voice, once heard in the open, disappears into the wilderness. The road becomes a kind of silent removal. There is no throne taken from him, no garment torn in public, no court announcing his disgrace, but something sacred is still being stripped away: his sense of belonging, his sense of safety, his sense that courage will always feel like fire in the bones. Loneliness often begins like that, not with one dramatic collapse, but with small removals. One door closes. One person stops answering. One prayer feels unanswered. One burden becomes too private to explain. One day the soul notices that the crowd has faded, and the road ahead is quiet. For Elijah, the pressure was real. The biblical story presents a world of danger, fear, and spiritual conflict. But the script must not turn that world into a cartoon battle. It must not reduce ancient people into symbols for modern anger. This is not a story for blaming Jewish history, attacking tradition, or turning sacred scripture into a weapon. It is a story about what fear can do to a human heart, even a heart that has known God. The first false belief begins to form here. If Elijah is afraid, maybe his faith has failed. That belief is dangerous because many listeners carry it secretly. They think exhaustion means they are weak. They think loneliness means God is disappointed. They think if they were truly faithful, silence would not hurt so much. But the biblical story is more compassionate than that. Elijah's fear does not make him worthless. His running does not erase every moment of obedience. His trembling does not cancel the God who once used him. He is not a machine. He is a human being carrying a sacred burden inside a fragile body. And that matters for the listener, because maybe you have known a version of that road. You did what you knew to do. You kept going. You tried to pray. You tried to stay steady. But somewhere along the way, your strength thinned. The people who once seemed close felt distant. The future no longer sounded clear. And the silence began whispering a false explanation. You are alone because you failed. That is not the voice this story wants you to trust. Elijah needed what many wounded souls need. He needed to be heard. He needed to be protected. He needed to be guided. He needed to be reminded that his value before God had not vanished simply because his strength had. And maybe that is what someone watching right now needs too, not a harsh explanation, not a quick command to be stronger, but the quiet reassurance that God does not measure your value by how loudly you can keep going. The road into the wilderness is painful because it shows dignity becoming hidden. No one standing beside him to say, "You are still called." No crowd to affirm him. No visible sign yet that mercy is near. Only a man walking farther into silence, And then the wilderness becomes more than scenery. It becomes the place where the first layer of loneliness deepens into something more frightening. Elijah is no longer simply separated from people. He begins to feel separated from hope itself. The road ends beneath a wilderness tree, and there, the prophet's strength gives way. Under the wilderness tree, Elijah does not sound like a man performing strength for anyone. The biblical account gives us a devastating glimpse of his exhaustion. He sits down, reaches the end of himself, and speaks words that carry the weight of a soul ready to stop. We should be careful not to diagnose him with modern language the text does not use, but we can say this much with reverence. Scripture presents him as deeply exhausted, afraid, and alone. This is where the sacred wound deepens. The humiliation is quiet. No one mocks him in the scene. No crowd points at him. No public official strips him of office. But there is another kind of humiliation, the private collapse of someone who can no longer carry the image others may have had of him. The prophet lies down. That image matters. A man known for speaking now has no speech left except pain. A servant known for standing now rests in the dust. The body tells the truth before the theology does. He is tired. This is where many people misunderstand suffering. They want the wounded to explain quickly. They want the lonely to learn quickly. They want grief to become testimony before it has been allowed to become honest. But pain itself was not good. Elijah's exhaustion was not beautiful because it hurt. The wound was not imaginary. The darkness was not holy because it was dark. And yet, in this very place, God's first response is not a lecture. It is care. Before the cave. Before the mountain. Before the wind and earthquake and fire. There is food. There is rest. There is enough strength for the next part of the journey. The mercy is physical before it becomes dramatic. God does not treat Elijah like a failed instrument. He treats him like a beloved servant whose body and soul have both become tired. This is one of the most healing details in the story. God's comfort arrives before Elijah has full understanding. There are seasons when people want answers, but what they receive first is enough strength to survive the night. A little bread, a little water, a little rest. A scripture remembered at the edge of despair. A quiet mercy that does not explain everything, but says, "You are still being held." That is not a small thing. The false explanation says, "If God were near, you would not be this tired." But Elijah's story whispers something gentler. Exhaustion does not place a person beyond God's care. The journey is not over. The wound is not healed. Elijah still has questions. He still has fear. He still has a long road ahead. Grace does not erase the suffering. It begins to give the suffering a different ending. This is where the listener should begin to feel. This is not just history. This is how my own waiting has felt. Because sometimes God's protection is hidden before it becomes visible. It does not first appear as a dramatic rescue. It appears as preservation. God preserves the life before restoring the calling. He strengthens the body before explaining the path. He gives Elijah enough for the journey before Elijah understands where the journey is leading. That matters because wounded people often think comfort only counts if it comes with immediate clarity. But sometimes comfort is not the full map. Sometimes comfort is the next breath. The bread and water do not answer every question. They do not remove every fear. They do not pretend the wilderness is gentle. But they prove something that fear had tried to bury. Heaven has not forgotten Elijah's body in the wilderness. Mercy is already moving beneath the silence. And with that mercy, Elijah rises. Not healed completely. Not triumphant. Not suddenly free of every wound. But strengthened enough to continue. He walks toward Horeb, the mountain of God. and the silence that once felt like emptiness begins to feel like it may be carrying something he has not yet heard. By the time Elijah reaches Horeb, the story can no longer return to what it was. The wilderness has stripped away the crowd. Exhaustion has stripped away the illusion of endless strength. The journey has carried him to a place where the question can no longer be avoided. Not the public question of what others think of him, but the private question that lives beneath so much spiritual loneliness. God, are you still speaking to me? According to the biblical account, Elijah enters a cave. Then the word of the Lord comes to him with a question. What are you doing here? That question must be handled carefully. It should not be written as cold accusation. In this sacred scene, it can be heard as an invitation. God allows Elijah to speak the wound. God gives space for the loneliness to come out of hiding. Elijah answers from the ache of his own perspective. He speaks of zeal, conflict, loss, danger, and isolation. The words carry the feeling of a man who believes he is the only one left. Whether the viewer knows the rest of the biblical account or not, the emotion is unmistakable. This is the sound of a servant whose pain has narrowed his vision until loneliness feels like the whole truth. And then comes the mountain. The Lord tells him to stand on the mountain. The scene becomes vast, almost unbearable. We can imagine the cave opening towards stone and sky. The scene might have looked something like this. Elijah standing near darkness while the mountain before him begins to tremble with forces larger than human strength. A great wind tears through, but the Lord is not in the wind. An earthquake follows, but the Lord is not in the earthquake. A fire comes, but the Lord is not in the fire. This is the midpoint point of no return. Elijah can no longer assume that the loudest thing is the truest thing. He can no longer measure God's nearness only by force, spectacle, or immediate emotional certainty. The proof is not a relic or inscription. The witness is Scripture itself. The sacred memory carried by the biblical text becomes impossible to ignore. The passage deliberately contrasts dramatic power with a quieter encounter. We should be careful here. This does not mean God never speaks through dramatic acts in Scripture. It does not mean God always speaks in only one emotional style. It does not give a formula for every lonely season. But in this story, the silence after the noise becomes holy ground, and this is where the healing possibility begins to appear. What looked like abandonment may have contained hidden preservation. What felt like silence may have been the place where fear's voice was being separated from God's voice. What seemed empty may have been the mercy of God refusing to let panic become the prophet's only teacher. Because fear is loud, shame is loud, panic is loud. The need to be approved by people is loud. The memories of failure are loud. The voice that says, "You are the only one left," can become so loud that it feels like truth. But not every loud thing is God's voice. For the listener, this is where the ancient mountain becomes painfully personal. Maybe your life has had wind sudden change, pressure, movement that left you breathless. Maybe it has had earthquake, the ground of your plans shaking beneath you. Maybe it has had fire conflict, loss, intensity, grief. And maybe when none of those things gave you the answer you wanted, you assumed God was absent. But Elijah's story opens another possibility. The silence was not the whole story. The fact that God was not found in the noise did not mean God was gone. It meant Elijah was being invited into a deeper kind of listening. Protection may be hidden before it becomes visible. At first, God protected Elijah with bread and rest. Now God protects him from confusing spectacle with presence. God guards the calling by teaching the prophet that panic cannot be allowed to impersonate divine truth. After the fire, the mountain grows quiet, and that quiet is no longer empty. It is charged with presence. Elijah stands at the edge of the cave, and the story moves toward the confrontation that will reveal what the lonely season was truly holding. The strongest confrontation in this story does not happen in a court. It happens at the mouth of a cave. There is no crowd chanting, no judge seated above Elijah, no enemy dragged forward for humiliation. The confrontation is deeper than that. It is the public unveiling of a false narrative inside the soul of a wounded man. With the mountain itself standing like a witness, fear has told Elijah, "You are finished." Exhaustion has told him, "You cannot go on." Loneliness has told him, "You are the only one left." Silence has tempted him to believe, God is no longer near. And now, after wind, earthquake, and fire have passed by, the quiet encounter comes. Translations and interpretations of the phrase are handled in different ways, so we should be careful not to flatten the mystery. Many believers have understood this moment as a gentle whisper, a quiet voice, or the sound of a thin silence. Whatever language is used, the movement of the passage is clear. Elijah recognizes the presence of God, not in the violent force, but in the quietness that follows. Then comes the object that gathers the whole story into one image: the cloak. Elijah wraps his face in his cloak and goes out to the entrance of the cave. That gesture is not shallow drama. It is reverence. It is recognition. It is the body responding to holy presence. The same man who had been running now steps forward. The same prophet whose voice had been buried beneath fear now stands where he can hear again. The cloak becomes a symbol of everything. Fear did not erase. His calling was still there. His dignity was still there. His relationship with God was still there. The lonely season had wounded him, but it had not removed him from the care of heaven. The hidden truth is revealed: God was not absent because he was not in the noise. That revelation changes the entire journey. The wilderness was not meaningless emptiness. The bread was not random mercy. The cave was not simply the end of courage. The mountain signs were not failed answers. All of it had been leading Elijah to the place where he could distinguish the voice of fear from the voice of God. This does not make the suffering good. It does not make the threat good. It does not make the loneliness good. The wound was real, but it was not the whole story. God speaks again. Elijah pours out the wound again, and God does not leave him with a vague feeling. He gives direction. He sends him forward. He reveals that Elijah's perception of total isolation is not the complete truth. The cost of fear becomes clear. Fear had narrowed Elijah's world until he could only see abandonment. Exhaustion had made him believe the story was over. Spiritual loneliness had turned one chapter into a final verdict. But God's quiet voice breaks that false verdict. This is divine vindication without cheap revenge. No enemy needs to be mocked. No human being needs to be reduced to a villain. The moral reversal is not Elijah was right and everyone else was worthless. The reversal is more sacred. Despair was not allowed to define the servant of God. What was preserved? Elijah's life. His calling. His ability to hear. His place in the unfolding work of God. Who was protected? Not a flawless hero untouched by pain, but an exhausted servant who had reached the edge of himself. And what must the audience reinterpret? The cave? At first, it looked like the place where Elijah's voice disappeared. Now it becomes the place where he heard more clearly. The silence. At first, it felt like abandonment. Now it becomes the space where God's voice could be recognized beneath the noise. The lonely season. At first, it seemed like proof that Elijah was forgotten. Now it becomes the hidden place where God preserved what fear tried to bury. For many believers, this moment became a sign that God's comfort can arrive quietly. And that quiet does not mean careless. The story does not answer every question about suffering. It does not explain every lonely room, every unanswered prayer, every delay, every grief, but it gives one sacred image of hope: a man at the mouth of a cave, a cloak over his face, a silence no longer empty, a voice fear could not imitate. Elijah does not leave the cave with every mystery solved. That matters. If the ending made everything easy, it would betray the wound. Real restoration is not the denial of pain. It is not pretending the wilderness did not happen. It is not saying the fear was imaginary or the exhaustion was weakness. Grace did not erase Elijah's weariness. It gave his weariness a different ending. What was taken from Elijah was not only comfort, it was clarity. His sense of being protected by God had been shaken. His voice had been driven inward. His belonging had narrowed until he believed he was alone. His hope had thinned until stopping seemed easier than continuing. So the restoration must match the wound. God restores direction. God restores perspective. God restores the dignity of Elijah's calling. God restores the possibility that a tired servant can still hear, still obey, still be guided, still matter. The biblical account continues with God giving Elijah a path forward and revealing that Elijah is not as alone as he believed. That truth is not a small correction. It is mercy. When pain tells a person, no one understands, no one remains, nothing is left, God can gently widen the story again. This is the healing message the listener should carry. The lonely season did not make the pain good, but God was able to meet Elijah there, preserve him there, and teach him to hear mercy more clearly than fear. Maybe that is what this story offers to someone watching in a quiet room, in a season no one else fully understands. Not a promise that loneliness will vanish tomorrow. Not a guarantee of an audible voice. Not a shallow sentence telling you to stop grieving, but a sacred reminder the darkness was not proof that God had stopped caring. The silence was not the whole story. What felt buried may still have been held. What fear tried to erase may still be remembered by heaven. God's protection in this story does not look like Elijah avoiding pain. It looks like preservation inside pain. Bread before explanation. Rest before assignment. A question before correction. A quiet voice after the storm. A calling guarded when the person carrying it could barely stand. That is a different kind of protection. It is gentle. It is believable. It does not deny suffering. It does not tell the wounded to smile at the cave. The cave hurt. The wilderness hurt. The silence hurt. But the cave did not get the final word. God did. And when God speaks, He does not sound like the voice that destroys hope. He does not sound like panic. He does not sound like shame. He does not sound like the accusation that says, "You are finished." His voice restores enough truth for the next faithful step. That is often how healing begins. Not with the whole future. One step, one remembered scripture, one breath of mercy, one quiet conviction that fear has been loud, but it has not been Lord. By the end, Elijah is not merely a prophet who survived a lonely season. He becomes a witness for every person who has mistaken silence for abandonment. His story says that God sees the exhausted. God can feed the weary. God can guide the confused. God can preserve the calling when fear has buried it under despair. And now the final image returns. The mountain has grown still. The wind has passed. The earthquake has ended. The fire has faded. No crowd stands below to applaud. No human voice announces that Elijah is restored. Only the cave, the cloak, the quiet. Elijah stands at the entrance, with his face covered, not because he has become powerful again in the eyes of people, but because he has recognized the nearness of God. Behind him is the darkness that once felt like an ending. Before him is the road he could not see before. and around him is a silence that no longer feels empty. A lonely man, still human, still marked by the journey, steps out from the cave because the voice of God has become clearer than the voice of despair. N. God never speaks through power. It means fear is not allowed to decide where God is. The wound was real, but it was not the whole story. The cave hurt, but the cave did not get the final word. God still knew Elijah's name, still guarded his life, still restored direction, and still gave him enough light for the next step. And maybe that is the quiet message for us. What feels buried in your life may still be held by God. What fear tried to erase may still be remembered by heaven. If this story spoke to a quiet place in your heart, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who may be walking through a lonely season. Sometimes a story like this reaches a person right when they need to remember that God has not forgotten them. I would also love to hear from you in the comments. What is one place in your life where you still need to believe God sees you, protects you, and can guide you through the silence? You do not have to share everything. Just one honest sentence may encourage someone else who feels alone. And if you want more sacred stories of Scripture, Christian memory, suffering, mercy, and restoration, make sure to subscribe. In the next video, we will step into another forgotten place where what looked hidden may have been quietly preserved by God for a purpose deeper than anyone first understood. Thank you for watching, and may you leave this story feeling less alone, more comforted, and gently reminded that your life still matters before God.